Today's lecture, we're going to be talking about Chapter 13, Learning and Memory. This is not only our last chapter for this section before we have our exam, but it is also the last lecture for the entire semester. So I'm sure many of you are very excited about that, so let's get right to it. We are going to talk about what learning and memory is. So you can't talk about learning without talking about memory. If you learn something and want to demonstrate your learning of it later on or want to, reproduce what you learned, it has to be consolidated into memory. So you can't talk about learning without talking about memory and vice versa. We are specifically going to focus on long-term memory today. And as is typical in psychology, kind of how we learned about a lot of these different subdivisions of memory that we're going to discuss was from individuals who suffered damage to certain brain areas. It's been very common when we've learned about different mood disorders, different just ailments of the body and the brain, different psychological concepts. It has been because of brain lesions or accidents or something like that, and we've been able to gain a lot of information. So we're going to talk about a few different patients and people. So we're going to talk about patient HM, Clive Waring, patient NA. We'll discuss a little bit about Korsakoff syndrome, patient KC. We'll discuss memory and brain regions, memory storage. We will start wrapping up our lecture with brain plasticity, discussing long-term potentiation, and then we're going to end our lecture with talking about Alzheimer's disease and different brain changes in Alzheimer's. This is definitely going to be a hefty lecture. There's a lot of information to cover in this lecture, so please take your time, take breaks if you need to. There's a lot of information, so just pace yourself. Very interesting, but just take it real slow. So let's start with what even is learning and what is memory. So learning is the process of acquiring new information, whereas memory is the ability to store and retrieve that information. So you acquire the information first, and then ideally it gets stored so that we can retrieve it later. Memory is also known as the specific information that is stored in the brain. There are also many different kinds of memory. There's different memory processes, different subdivisions of different types of memory, and we are going to discuss all of that. So we have 3 different processes for memory. We first have our sensory buffer. We then have short-term memory, and then long-term memory. So we're going to talk about what each of these is. The first one, let me get my little laser pointer out here. Laser. Okay. So first you just have incoming information that comes in. It's going to hit what we call our sensory buffer, and then it gets transferred into our short-term memory. Not every single thing that we come in contact with throughout the whole day is going to be taken into short-term and then to long-term memory. We cannot feasibly remember every single solitary detail of what we see and what we hear, what comes into our sensory information, what we smell, what we touch, throughout the whole entire day. You're not going to remember every single crack that was on the concrete that you saw when you were walking. You're not going to remember seeing every single insect or bird that was outside in your backyard. So some of that information definitely gets forgotten. So if that information is rehearsed, it's going to go into short-term memory. And then if it gets rehearsed even further, it's going to go into long-term memory. And then of course we do have loss of information at each of these stages. So let's talk about this. I know that was a lot of information to throw at you, so let's break this down a little bit. So first we have the sensory buffer. We have sensory input that comes into our sensory buffer. So it could be things we see, things we touch, things we hear, things we smell, even things that we taste. So they are going to hit our sensory buffer. And then that information is either going to be forgotten or it transfers into our short-term memory. And that is if that information is rehearsed, it will get transferred into short-term memory. If it's not rehearsed, once it hits the sensory buffer, we will just forget it. So if that information does get rehearsed, it is going to make the next jump into our short-term memory. Now, some people think that short-term memory is like, oh, things that happened an hour ago or things that happened a day ago. That's my short-term memory. That's actually not. Short-term memory it lasts for less than 30 seconds. You'll typically see less than a minute, maybe on some other sources that you might look at for short-term memory, but in this class we are going to say that it is less than 30 seconds. Short-term memory is also known as our working memory. It has a very limited capacity. So as you can see, we have less than 30 seconds. You're not able to cram a ton of information within 30 seconds. So it has a very limited capacity in what you can hold in your short-term memory. And it is very dependent on rehearsal. If you rehearse it enough, it is going to make the next jump into being consolidated into your long-term memory. So, again, sensory information hits the sensory buffer. It's either forgotten. If it's rehearsed, it's going to make the jump into short-term memory. Short-term memory is you can only hold something in short-term memory for about 30 seconds. If the information is rehearsed further, it starts to be consolidated into your long-term memory. Does your long-term memory hold this information forever? Very possible. It's kind of hard for us to test things like this, but for all intents and purposes, we tend to believe that long-term memory, you could potentially hold something in there forever. The capacity, is it unlimited? Seemingly, again, yes. It's hard for us to test the capacity of somebody's long-term memory, the full capacity of it, but we tend to believe that it is unlimited in its capacity. And long-term memory does not rely on rehearsal. So, for example, if you are teaching a little kid their house phone number, you tell them, okay, it's 388-4537. That was my childhood phone number. So that kid is going to learn that phone number. There's a point where they're learning it for the first time, right? So it enters into their sensory buffer. Maybe they repeat it a little bit. It's held in their short-term memory. Then it gets consolidated into their long-term memory. Now, that kid, say it's me, that was my childhood phone number. I don't have to sit here on a day-to-day basis and repeat my childhood phone number every single day in order for me to make sure that it is stored in my long-term memory. So that's what I mean when I say that long-term memory does not rely on rehearsal. Once something kind of gets consolidated into long-term memory, it's there. So any issues that we have in recalling information, those are issues with retrieval, which is a whole different lecture that we could make on that. But essentially, long-term memory does not rely on rehearsal, where short-term memory does. So here's a table to kind of organize this information a little bit better. So we have length of time, reliance on rehearsal, and capacity, and we're looking at the differences in short-term and long-term memory. So long-term memory is seemingly forever, where short-term memory can only really hold something for less than 30 seconds. Rehearsal. Long-term memory does not rely on rehearsal. Once it's kind of in there, it's in your long-term memory. However, short-term memory, in order to keep something in short-term memory so that it can be transferred to long-term, it does rely on rehearsal. The capacity. Long-term memory is pretty much, for all we know, unlimited. Whereas the capacity for someone's short-term memory is around 7 plus or minus 2 items. You can test this by, say, if you look at a word list of multiple words and you're sitting there, you're looking at them, you're trying to remember as many as you can. When you then go back and you try to remember and write down all of the words that you recall, it's typically going to be between 5 and 9 words. So that's why we say 7 plus or minus 2. So 7 minus 2 is 5, 7 plus 2 is 9. This is a big reason, actually, why, because research has showed us that this 7 plus or minus 2 is a real thing. This is actually why phone numbers were created to be 7 digits, because they found that that was around the average amount of items that someone could hold in their working memory. So if they needed to kind of recall, remember a phone number, like for a brief period of time, and call the phone number, of course, before we had contacts in our phone, they could do that. So we're going to predominantly focus on long-term memory for the duration of this lecture because, short-term memory is only about 30 seconds. So even if we're talking about something that happened to you this morning or last night that you remember, that is long-term memory. So there are many different types of long-term memory. We have non-declarative memory, which is also known as procedural memory. And this is memory that for things that are performed. So these are memories for actions, skills, operations, things that we can show people that we have memory for. So this is also known as our how memory. So I'm going to show you guys a few different types of procedural memory so that hopefully it makes it a little more clear about what I mean by things that are performed or how memories. So within non-declarative memory, we have things like skill learning. Skill learning is performing tasks that require motor control. And also in skill learning, you are learning by repeating. So you're learning by repeating a motor function or a motor task. An example of this, classic, riding a bike would be skill learning. Driving a car is skill learning. Learning how to flip the perfect pancake. Those are all skill learning. So you learn to be better at these things by repeating those tasks over and over again, repeating those motor movements. So with riding a bike, you're holding your balance. You know where to put your hands on the handlebars, your feet on the pedals, how much pressure, how much force. That's something that you kind of have to show someone that you know how to do. You have to perform that. You could just verbally say it, but if somebody really wanted to test if you knew how to ride a bike, you would have to get on the bike and perform that, right? Or flipping a pancake or driving a car. We also have priming. So again, this is something that we are showing. So priming is the tendency for an exposure to a stimulus that helps later responses to the same or similar stimuli. So if we are presented with something and then later on we see a stimulus that looks exactly the same or that resembles it, because we have seen this stimulus earlier, it is going to influence our behavior or our reaction to something later. We're going to look at an example of this if this sounds, confusing to you. So, for example, this is the example that's used in your book. If you are shown a word list or you're shown like a few words really rapidly, like one after another for like a split second on a screen. So say they're showing you like all of these, pretty simple words. And one of those words is stamp. And then later they ask you to do like a word completion task. So they show you these STEM words that have like a couple letters in the beginning and you're supposed to fill in the rest of what you think that word is or whatever is the first thing that comes to your mind. If you were shown stamp earlier and then you're asked, okay, complete this word, STA. You are more likely to complete this word as stamp than you are, for instance, as start. Start is another word that starts with STA. We see that the effects of priming can even be if you do not remember seeing the word stamp. Even if stamp was flashed on a screen for a time period that is like below your conscious awareness, but it's like, because it's so quick, we see that in research, people will still complete this word as stamp. They can say like, I don't remember even seeing that word, But they did, right? Their brain clearly took in that information, and it's definitely the percentages that we see are much more than something that could be by chance or coincidence. So those are kind of the effects of priming. Priming is used in a lot of advertising. You can prime people with different moods. You can prime people with colors. So, for instance, if you show somebody, if you're show them like the color yellow, and then you ask them to talk about words that come to mind, they might say like, oh, banana, giraffe, lemon. That it can influence them to say certain stimuli that are yellow themselves. So those are examples of what priming are. So that shows us when we see somebody, such as like finishing a word with stamp, if they were shown stamp earlier, that is showing us that they clearly saw the word stamp earlier, and that they are remembering that, and that it is influencing their behavior. So again, this is something, this is memory that somebody could perform for us and show us. We also have conditioning. This is another kind of subdivision of non-declarative memory, and this is associative learning. So what do I mean by associative learning? I mean the association between two stimuli or between a stimuli and a particular response. We have different types of conditioning. I'm not going to go into like crazy detail about them. You probably learned about these in your Psych 100 class if you took Psych 100. Classical conditioning is all about pairing a neutral stimulus with a conditioned response. So pairing something that you previously had like no reaction to, but now that those things have been paired, you have started to form a reaction to it. The classic example of this is Pavlov's dog. So if you're not familiar with Pavlov's dog, we'll review it very quickly. Pavlov's dog is where we set up this experiment with a dog. It's very famous. And what happens is that we were able to get the dog to start salivating by just hearing the sound of a bell. So let's look at kind of what happened with that. So before, a dog knows to salivate when it sees food. This is a natural reflex response that a dog has to seeing food. I have my puppy, Poppy. I literally pick up her bowl and she sees me go into the garage and she starts like freaking out, barking, like salivating because she knows that food is coming and she's hungry, and food is just a natural reflex reaction to want to eat food, right? So then we have a bell. If I were to ring a bell in front of Poppy, she would probably kind of tilt her head and look at me weird. She's not going to salivate when she sees it. She might like get a little startled, but she's probably not going to really run away from it. It's not going to be something that makes her super scared. It's neutral. So this is what I mean by a neutral stimulus. It doesn't evoke any sort of like reaction. What would happen is if I started to ring a bell every single time that I went to go get Poppy's food, or when I presented her with the food, you're going to see salivation because she sees the food, but I'm also ringing the bell in the background. So if I do that over and over again, what will happen is that eventually Poppy will start salivating just when she hears the bell. She could literally, like, it could get to a point, I should actually do this to see, because I know it will work with her. Anytime they heard that sound, whatever you have paired with the food, just the sound alone will produce the reaction. Whereas before, we had no response. But now we have a reaction. So again, this is something that someone or something, like an animal, can show us, can perform for us that they have learned. It's very difficult. Somebody could say, explain that they are able to associate these things, but really if you want to test to see if like classical conditioning has worked, you have to see it in action. So this is why this is procedural memory. This is why this is non-declarative memory for something. It's something that is performed. It's something that is shown. It is a how memory. So that was a little brief overview of what classical conditioning is. So in this example with Pavlov's dog, the dog, or my puppy Poppy, has been classically conditioned to salivate in response to the sound of a bell. We also have instrumental conditioning or operant conditioning. And this is the association of a particular behavior with some sort of reinforcement. Now, it could be something that's positive, it could be something that's negative, it could be a consequence, it could be a reward. But a very simple example of this would be a rat learning to press a lever and get food, which is a reward. So the behavior is pressing the lever, and the reinforcement here is food. So it's pairing pressing this lever, doing this behavior, with receiving this reward. So this is called a Skinner box. So the rat presses the bar for the food. So once you start to associate those things, the rat learns, okay, every time I press a lever, I'll get food. Cool, it will continue to press that lever. So when we see that rat continually pressing that lever, it is demonstrating to us that it has learned that food and lever are associated with each other. This is something that the rat can show us. So we talked about a lot of different types of non-declarative memories. So now we're going to switch gears and talk about declarative memory. So declarative memory, whereas non-declarative memory are things that are performed, declarative memory is memory for things that can be stated or described. This is also memory for just general factual information. And whereas non-declarative memory is known as the how memory, declarative memory is the what memory. We have a couple different types of declarative memory. We have episodic memory. This is memory for things that are chronological or dated. And personal experiences, so autobiographical memories. An example of this would be if I were to talk about my 5th birthday party, and I talked about, what I did, what I got. That is a personal experience that is tied to a very specific date. Whereas we have semantic memory, and this is memory for general knowledge. This is not tied to a time or a date. An example of this would be memory for states and capitals. So I have that right over here. Now, you likely do not remember what was the exact date and time and year and all of that stuff for when you learned states and capitals. Maybe you do, and if you do, then that would be an episodic memory. But being able to know that, Sacramento is the capital of California and Austin is the capital of Texas, that is just kind of general knowledge. That is not autobiographical information. So we have episodic memory and semantic memory, and those are both different kinds of declarative memory. So we've talked about how we have short-term memory versus long-term memory. We have declarative versus non-declarative memory. We have episodic versus semantic memory. But how do we know that our memory is divided in this way? Why would we not think that, we always hear, the hippocampus is really important for memory. Hippocampus probably handles all of this. It handles short-term, long-term, declarative, non-declarative. It's responsible for all of that. It's just one system. But that's actually not how our brain is wired. But how do we know that our memory is divided in these ways and it's also tied to different brain regions? Well, as is popular in many things that we have learned in the field of psychology, we have learned about these different divisions of memory and different parts of the brain associated with different memories in people who have either had accidents or in animal studies with lesioning certain areas of the brain. So we're going to discuss a few different cases that led us to learn about different aspects of memory. So the first person that we have is patient HM. His name was Henry Gustav Molaison, but you can just know him, refer to him as patient HM. So, patient HM had very severe epilepsy. And epilepsy is a brain condition in which causes people extreme seizures. They can be, they don't have to necessarily be like really extreme seizures, but seizures nonetheless. Patient HM's case, he had very, very severe seizures. He had what is considered a bilateral loci. And what this does is it triggers seizures in both hemispheres of the brain. So he really suffered with this, and they were trying to figure out, okay, like what can we do for him? How can we relieve his symptoms? So he underwent this very radical surgery, which this is not really done at all anymore. We never really want to be removing parts of someone's brain unless it's under a really, really severe case. But the surgery that they did was a bilateral temporal lobectomy. And what they did is they removed the hippocampus, amygdala, and the surrounding cortex. So these are both found in the temporal lobe. And so they didn't, remove all of the cortex and everything, but definitely a decent amount of the temporal lobe, and it's bilateral, so we know that it's on both sides. So your hippocampus is a structure that is bilateral. You have part on the left, part on the right. Your amygdala is. And so that's what we mean by bilateral lobectomy. So here's normal brain, and this is what we did in HM's brain. So what we found after he underwent that surgery is he had, when we subjected him to an IQ test, he had a completely normal IQ. However, he suffered amnesia. So it relieved his epilepsy symptoms, but then he was left with severe memory impairment. That's what amnesia is. Patient HM had moderate retrograde amnesia, and retrograde amnesia is backward acting. So these are memories for things that were formed before the onset, or in his case, before he had the surgery that removed those different structures of his brain. So he had moderate retrograde amnesia. So there were certain memories before he had his surgery that he couldn't quite recall. However, he had extremely severe anterograde amnesia. So these are forward-acting memories. These are memories formed after onset, or again, in his case, memories formed after he had his surgery and removed certain parts of his brain. So moderate retrograde amnesia, there's a few things that he can't remember from before he had his surgery, but it's mostly intact. However, he cannot form any new memories from after he had his surgery, which is pretty crazy. So, like I said, I actually did not say this on the last slide, but his short-term memory we found was intact. So he had perfectly fine short-term memory. He had working memory. He could remember, 7 plus or minus 2 items. But his long-term memory was very severely impaired. He had okay procedural memories, so we were able to test procedural memory for him. Of course, procedural memory are performance memories, so that's why we were able to test that in him. Those are things that he could show us. And we found that he had okay procedural memory, non-declarative memories, but he could not form any new declarative memories at all. Nothing new after the onset or after his surgery. So we have done many, many tests with HM, and here are some really popular ones. So the first test that we're going to talk about is the mirror star tracing test. So as you can see in this test, somebody has a block that blocks them from being able to look down and see what they're doing. They have to look in a mirror, and there is a star, and it has 2 lines. You can kind of see right here, there's a little space in between, and you have to take your pencil and trace the star within these two lines. So mirror star tracing test. So you're sitting there. For anybody, this would be, a challenging task. You can't look down. You're doing everything backwards because you're looking in a mirror. And this is, of course, a motor task, right? So he's tracing the star, looking in the mirror. And so these are different graphs that show how he did performance-wise. We gave him this test on multiple days. So this shows how many errors he had per trial. And you can see when he first started it, he made a lot of errors. So he was going outside of the lines a lot. That's counted as an error. So a lot of errors on his first trial. Then as we go, so he went up to 10 trials in one day. Then as he continues with the trials, we see that his errors start to go down and they go up a little bit, but this is a general trend towards less errors. So this is day 1. Day 2, you start with your first trial of day 2. There's around 10 errors. Then we go to practically none. Go up a little bit, but as you can see, there are much less errors on day 2 over the course of the trials than there are on day 1. Then we get to day 3, and what we see on day 3 is that between trials 1 to 10, there's virtually no errors. Patient HM is able to do the mirror star tracing task well. He's not going outside of the lines. We also put him through this other test called a mirror reverse text test. And what happens with this is you can teach somebody to read this text backwards. So you can teach somebody how to do it. So we taught HM how to read this text, and he was able to practice. And he got better and better each time that he saw this reverse text or different things written in reverse text. But he had absolutely no memory for learning that whatsoever. But we saw in his performance of it that he was improving. So in patient HM, we were able to uncover the difference between declarative versus non-declarative or procedural memories. So remember, patient HM, he cannot form new declarative long-term memories, which is why he was unable to, like with the reverse text, or if you asked him about the mirror star tracing task, he is unable to say that he's ever done that before. He has no memory of being able to outright say, like, yes, I have done this before. Yeah, I did it the other day. He has no memory for that. So he cannot form any new declarative long-term memories. However, his short-term memory and his non-declarative memory was perfectly intact. This is why we saw that he was able to increase his performance on the star tracing task, and why he was also able to increase his performance on the mirror reverse text task. Those are things, again, that show performance. So he was able to improve on trials between days. Day 1, day 2, day 3, he got better, so he kept improving. So that shows us non-declarative memory. That shows us procedural memory. So we can see that he is able to improve on something, and in order to do that, there has to be something in his brain that is able to recall that he has done that before. But since he cannot form any new declarative long-term memories, he is unable to recognize that he has ever done that task before. So again, with patient HM, we learned the difference between declarative versus non-declarative forms of memory. And recall that HM had his hippocampus removed as one of the parts that was removed in his temporal lobectomy. So we do know that the hippocampus is very necessary for forming specifically declarative memories. Different diseases can also cause memory loss. You can have, particularly memory loss is related to loss or damage in the medial temporal lobe. Things like herpes simplex viral encephalitis. This causes damage or loss to the medial temporal lobe. We're going to talk about or watch a video about someone named Clive Waring who suffers from this and kind of see what his symptoms are. And another thing that also causes damage to the medial temporal lobe is ischemia. And ischemia is essentially it's a heart attack. It causes, or a stroke. It causes low blood supply to travel to the brain. And again, so ischemia, we're talking about a stroke or a heart attack. And the hippocampus is very sensitive to oxygen deprivation. So when you're decreasing the blood supply to the brain, that means that our blood carries oxygen in our bodies. It carries oxygen to, especially to our brain, but all of our tissues, organs, all that good stuff. So when you decrease blood supply to the brain, you're decreasing oxygen being able to reach the brain. And we've seen that the hippocampus is super sensitive to being deprived of oxygen, so it can cause a lot of issues. And the hippocampus is found within the medial temporal lobe. So we're going to watch a YouTube video about Clive Waring. This is like a classic psychology video that I have watched multiple times in classes so that you can kind of see what Clive suffers from and kind of what his memory loss looks like.
Do you know how we got here?
No.
You don't remember sitting down?
No.
I reckon we've been here about 10 minutes at least.
Well, I've no knowledge of it. My eyes have started working now, and all I've seen the whole time I've been seeing anything at all is that.
And do you feel absolutely normal?
Not absolutely normal, no. Completely confused.
Confused?
Yes. If you've never eaten anything, never tasted anything, never touched anything, or smelled anything, what right have you to assume you're alive?
But you are?
Well, apparently, yes. But I'd like to know what the hell's been going on.
Clive was an outstanding musician.
He would take his work very, very seriously. At the same time, he loved music so much that he just really threw himself into it totally.
Clive was a musician of enormous integrity.
He was the world's expert on Lassus, one of the 3 or 4 great composers of the Renaissance.
And he also worked a great deal in contemporary music and was chorus master of the London Sinfonietta, which was Europe's foremost group.
Music flows out of him, whether he's singing or playing or conducting.
Clive Waring, through a cruel twist of fortune, shows us how fundamental consciousness and memory are to our lives.
Well. Isn't that a surprise? It's a smashing surprise. Why have I not seen you before?
I don't know. Have you not seen me before?
No. This is the first time.
Are you pleased to see me?
Oh, bet I am. There's nobody else I care about in the world as a whole.
Oh, darling. So how are you feeling this morning?
I'm conscious for the first time. It's the first time I've seen anybody at all.
Not been conscious before?
No.
I've been here before this
I
morning.
haven't seen you before.
No, you haven't?
No. I've not seen anything at all before. Been completely blind the whole time. No taste at all. This is the first taste I've had.
That's the first coffee you've had?
Yes. Cheers.
Cheers. And how are you seeing things?
Absolutely normally. It's the first time.
Full colour?
Yes. I've never seen anything the whole time I've been ill. No black and white, nothing.
Do you remember me arriving?
No. I don't remember any arrival at all. I don't remember writing any of that at all. Nothing to do with me consciously. It's been unconscious writing.
What are you doing here?
Well, I don't know, presumably playing patience, but I mean, that's the first time I've seen any cards.
Is it?
Yes.
Do you remember starting the game? It all started with a headache. Clive came home one day and said he had a very bad headache. The headache didn't lift, it didn't respond to analgesics. By the 4th day, he developed quite a high fever. And on the evening of the 4th day, for a little while, he forgot his daughter's name. By the 5th day, he was very delirious.
Well, Clive suffered from viral encephalitis, which has led to the damage of the left and the right temporal lobes, plus a good portion of the left frontal lobe. Now, the temporal lobes contain a structure called the hippocampus, which we know is implicated in memory function, and in Clive it has almost certainly been completely destroyed in both sides of his brain. It's this that is primarily responsible for his severe memory impairment. In addition, the damage to his frontal lobes also causes a number of additional memory problems, which are manifest mostly in terms of him repeating himself a lot and generally showing highly emotional behaviour.
Clive's world now consists of a moment with no past to anchor it and no future to look ahead to. It is a blinkered moment. He sees what is right in front of him, but as soon as that information hits the brain, it fades. Nothing makes an impression, nothing registers. Everything goes in perfectly well because he has all his faculties, his intellect is virtually intact, and he perceives his world as you or I do. But as soon as he's perceived it and looked away, it's gone for him. So it's a moment-to-moment consciousness, as it were, a time vacuum. And everything before that moment is completely void. And he feels as if he's awakening afresh the whole time.
Lovely hand you've got. Beautiful, marvellous tickets.
You're in a very good mood today.
Fantastic. I'm awake for the first time. You're the first person I've seen.
It's very nice to meet you.
How has it been?
It's been about 2.5 years now, Mr. Graham.
Imagine one night, 2.5 years
Not
long.
for one moment.
That's what it's been like. Not seen anything until now. Not even anything before this game. I've given the impression of being consciously awake. Not true.
He always thinks he's been awake for about 2 minutes. And that's why he looks at his watch all the time to record it, to record the fact, I've woken up, this is an important event, therefore I will write it down in my diary. So he writes, 11:54 a.m. I am now completely awake for the first time. And he underlines first time. Patience begins, because he's always playing patience. And the whole diary, every page, is a succession of entries saying almost the same thing, of first awakeness. And when he goes back and looks at his own entries, he doesn't acknowledge that they are genuine. He says, he knows it's his handwriting, but as far as he's concerned, he was unconscious when he wrote them. So he quite often, he'll score out what he's written before. And so his life is an ever-repeating moment of first awakening. The strongest thing in his life, I believe, and his diaries bear that out, is his love for me. And that's absolutely raw. And each time I walk into that room, it is as if it's the first time he's seen me for years.
Good heavens above! Well, darling.
Hello. You surprised to see me?
Well, the first time I've seen anybody at all. You're the first person I've seen.
You have not seen me before this morning?
No, I haven't.
I have been here. So how are you feeling this morning?
I'm conscious for the first time. It's the first time I've seen anybody at all.
Not been conscious before?
No.
I've been here before this
I
morning.
haven't seen you before.
No, you haven't?
No. I've not seen anything at all before. Been completely blind the whole time.
Don't remember me arriving at all?
No. No, I don't remember that you arrived from at all.
No.
No idea at all.
But do you know who I am? Or do you kiss all women like that?
Of course. You know I love you. I don't kiss anybody
Yes, I
else.
do know. I do know. You've written it all over your diary. Look. I bet you that if I look to see what you've written, you haven't mentioned me on that page.
Well,
You've mentioned me on this page. My first thought, I adore Deborah for eternity.
that's right.
People's entries in the diary are rubbish. What does that mean?
I've no idea.
Did you write that?
I've no conscious knowledge of it at all, no. You're showing it me now for the first time.
But is it your handwriting?
Yes, it is. But I know nothing about it at all.
So how do you think it got there?
I don't. I presume the doctor don't know.
But you must.
No, I haven't. You listen to me, please, for heaven's sake. When I say no, I mean exactly that. I haven't seen the book at all till now.
No, all I'm saying.
No, that means I haven't seen it, I have no knowledge of it at all. That's all. There's no knowledge of that book at all. It's entirely new to me.
But I'm
So
only saying.
just use your intelligence and let's have a comment which is intelligent.
But you've put. Who would put that apart?
I don't know, but no. Oh, for heaven's sake, use your intelligence, for heaven's sake. I haven't read the bloody thing. Well, use your intelligence.
Clive gets extraordinarily angry, and who wouldn't? Because here you're not dealing with somebody who is demented, who is oblivious, who is gaga. You are dealing with a perfectly lucid, highly intelligent man who has been robbed of knowledge of his own life, and he feels deeply humiliated to be put in that position. Very, very frustrated that he can't grasp what's wrong with him, because even as you're telling him, he's forgetting the previous sentence.
Clive has lost a form of memory which probably distinguishes human beings perhaps from all other animals. He's lost the highest form of memory, the form of memory that enables you to relate yourself to the past and project yourself into the future. So, in a sense, he feels like a man adrift.
Well, as far as I'm concerned, I haven't heard a note of music, seen any music, had any contact with music at all.
You're still a very good conductor and a very, very good player. And you still sing with a beautiful voice.
It was completely unknown to me.
Do you think if you sat down at the
I
organ...
dread to think. That's a private thing for me. I don't know what will happen, do I?
I know, because I've heard you. And you play beautifully, still.
I haven't heard a note of music.
1, 2, 3, 4.
You know, the saying, you never forget how to ride a bicycle. Well, to Clive, singing, playing, sight reading, score reading music is as automatic as riding a bicycle or eating a meal or getting dressed. It's an ingrained skill. It's something you never forget. When Clive finishes a piece, the reason he almost always goes into that sort of belching, choking, fitting convulsion is because the moment the music stops, he's let down out of what was a sort of safety net for him. And suddenly he's lost again.
I can't remember now. I've forgotten.
Whatever the damage, however devastating the damage, his being, his centre, his soul, is absolutely functioning as it ever did. The very fact that he is so despairing, so much in anguish, so angry, so much in love with me, those are all real human passions. And he's showing them almost to the exclusion of everything else. All he shows us is raw human passion, straight from the heart of the mind.
What if you could get glowing skin overnight?
So that was the video about Clive Wearing. So I just wanted you to kind of get an idea of what his kind of amnesia looked like. We can, read about these things and I can lecture about them, but sometimes it's helpful to actually, see, okay, well, what does that look like in real life? I'm fairly certain that Clive is still alive. I actually want to look that up right now. He's either still alive or he passed. Yeah, he is still alive. So he's 81 years old. He's very much still alive. And he is still with his wife, Deborah. There's some like updated videos of them. There's a longer documentary on YouTube if you're interested in it. It's like 40 something minutes long. But yeah, so that is Clive Wearing. So now we're going to talk about patient NA. And patient NA kind of leads us into talking about how damage to other areas of the brain can also cause memory loss. So we talked about damage to the medial temporal lobe. That's what Clive Wearing has. But there are other areas in which someone can have damage and also experience different kinds of memory loss. So we have patient NA, and they suffered from anterograde amnesia. They had damage to their dorsal medial thalamus. So again, this is different from the medial temporal area. So recall that anterograde amnesia is forward-acting memories, so memories after onset or after the damage. So patient NA had damage to their dorsal medial thalamus, and they were also missing their mammillary bodies, which is another structure in the brain. And patient NA had intact short-term memory, so short-term memory worked perfectly fine. The non-declarative part of their memory, so procedural memories, the performance-type memories, they displayed that they had relatively normal non-declarative memory. But they could not form new declarative long-term memories. We can also have memory loss for something like Korsakoff syndrome. We've talked about Korsakoff syndrome when we talked about drugs and addiction. So Korsakoff syndrome is a memory deficiency due to a lack of thiamine, and more than likely, people who severely lack thiamine are individuals who are chronic alcoholics. So what alcohol does, it does deplete your thiamine in a pretty big way. So someone who's a chronic alcoholic has a severe lack of thiamine, and that is what's causing the memory deficiency. Korsakoff syndrome is also known as wet brain. It is completely irreversible. So once someone has Korsakoff syndrome, you can't really alleviate it. The damage is pretty permanent. It causes brain damage to the mammillary bodies and the basal frontal lobes of your brain. And in particular, the temporal lobe and the hippocampus of someone who has Korsakoff syndrome are totally normal, but you have damage in the mammillary bodies and the basal frontal lobes. A key symptom of Korsakoff syndrome is called confabulation. So confabulation means that somebody is filling in their gap in memory with false information, so information that is not true. So essentially they are experiencing a type of like false memory system. So again, what's important to note in here is that brain damage is occurring in the mammillary bodies, which is similar to patient NA, and the basal frontal lobes and the cortex. However, their temporal lobe and their hippocampus is normal, yet they still have memory deficiencies. Next, we have patient KC. Patient KC was in a traffic accident, particularly a motorcycle accident. And patient KC experienced amnesia or severe memory loss due to experiencing damage to the frontal parietal and occipital cortex. And he also experienced severe shrinkage of his hippocampus. So this is patient KC right here. And with patient KC, we saw differences in semantic versus episodic memory. And patient KC had intact semantic memory, so general knowledge was totally fine. However, he was unable to retrieve past personal episodic memories. So, for instance, patient KC, he knows how to play chess. You can sit there, he loves playing chess, you can play a game of chess with him, but he's unable to tell you when in his life he learned how to play chess. So that is an episodic memory, whereas the semantic is, knowing he can tell you about the game of chess, tell you rules about it, things like that. But he is unable to tell you how he learned or even when he learned. He has no knowledge of doing that. So we are going to watch a little video about patient KC.
Well, why don't we begin with what we usually do first. Could you please state your name?
Kent Cochran.
And when were you born?
August 5th, 1951.
So that makes you how old now?
What year is it?
You tell us.
88?
Yes.
So I'm 37.
Very good. What's the address here?
1142 Brooks Drive.
And what town are we in?
Mississauga.
Where is Mississauga in relation to Toronto?
It's just west of Toronto.
Who else lives in this house?
My mother and father.
So the three of you?
Yeah.
How long have you lived here?
Since 1960.
So that means how many years?
26 years.
All right. Let me now ask a few questions by way of general information. Do you know who was Louis Armstrong?
I think he was a jazz great.
Some time ago?
Yeah.
Is he still alive?
No.
Mm-hmm. What direction would you go if you went from Chicago to Mexico City?
South.
Why are dark clothes warmer than light-colored clothes?
Because they absorb the sun's radiation.
Very good. On what continent is the Sahara Desert?
Africa.
Very nice. 3 kinds of blood vessels in the human body, as you know. Can you name them?
Artery, vein, and capillary.
Very good. What is a thermostat?
It's a heat gauge.
What does it do?
Measures the amount of heat.
All right. What's stellite?
I don't know.
Do you know what is a spiral mandrel?
No.
Does the expression number of turns in transition mean anything to you?
It's the number of spirals on a screw, I guess.
What kind of a screw?
Feed screw.
All right. You liked cars and motorcycles, didn't you?
I guess so.
Did you own one?
I owned a motorcycle and a car.
You owned a motorcycle and a car. What make was your car?
Honda.
And what color?
Brown.
Did you ever have to have any problems with the car? Ever get a flat tire, for instance?
I think I had a crash with it, but I don't remember.
Had a crash with a Honda?
Yeah.
But you don't remember any flat tires. Do you know how to change a flat tire?
Yeah.
Can you tell us? Can you give us a sort of as detailed account as you can about how does one go about changing a flat tire.
Well, first you stop when you know it's flat.
Yes.
And then you go around back and open up the trunk, take out the jack and the spare tire, and then you put the jack under the car and take the handle out of the jack, pump up the jack, and that raises the car. Then you take the socket wrench and take off the bolts off the tire and take the tire off and put the other tire on, put the bolts back on and take the jack down, and you change the tire.
That's very good. How do you know how to change a flat tire if you don't know whether you've ever done it yourself?
It's just one of the things you know, I guess.
One of the things you know. You think everyone knows it? You think your mother knows it?
Yeah.
Has she done it?
I don't know.
So that was the video about patient KC. So as you can see, he has fully intact semantic memory. He can tell you, you know, how to change the tire on a car. He could tell you different information. He can tell you even like what kind of car that he used to own. But then when you ask him, and he talks about, oh, I think I was in a crash, but I'm not sure. So he can't remember the episodic memories. He can't remember when he had the crash. He can't remember knowledge, or not knowledge. He can't have a memory for when he changed a tire himself. So that is how he had issues with his issues with his episodic memory, but fully intact semantic memory. Moving on, so we're going to talk about memory and brain regions. So we've kind of been getting at that with discussing these different patients, but we've also tested this further in animal research. So big research that we have done is testing declarative memory in monkeys. And what we've done with monkeys is we've put them in a couple different tasks. And the first one that we're going to talk about is called a delayed non-matching to sample task. And in this task, you present someone, which in this case it's a monkey or something, with an object, and they have to show us the object that is new or the object that was not previously seen before. So let's look at this in a little more detail. So the monkey is initially presented with a sample object. When he displaces it, he finds a pellet of food underneath. So cool, here's an object, moves it, there's the pellet of food, great. Now here is the test. After a variable delay, so it could be a delay of a few seconds to a few minutes, the monkey is presented with the original object where he already knew, okay, in this case it's a key, okay, I knew I already found food under the key. Presented with the original object he was already shown before, and also a new object. So over a series of trials with different pairs of objects, the monkey learns that the food is present under the object that differs from the sample. So the monkey declares his memory of the key by not choosing it. So what happens is you keep presenting the sample stimulus with different stimuli, and what the monkey starts to learn is like, oh, now the food has switched to be under whatever is different under here. So that again shows that learning is taking place, that's showing that memory is taking place. So of course, if there is an issue, if the monkey keeps picking up the key and is not catching on to how the food is under here, there is an issue with that. We have also tested declarative memory in monkeys with the visual paired comparison task. And this is a task in which we look at the tendency to gaze at a novel object. So we can do, we have technology that helps track eye gaze. So where something is looking at, how long, things like that. So this is an example. So you show someone or something two identical images. So this in this example, it's kind of this little sun shaped within a circle. You familiarize them with it. Then you present the familiarized stimulus with a novel stimulus. So in this sense, it's a triangle. So this is new from this trial. And you track the looking time at this new stimulus. Then you do it again and you flip-flop them and you again look at the gaze time on this new stimulus. And what we see is that if we damage the medial temporal lobe in monkeys, they have impairment in both of these tasks. So if we go back, in the non-matching to sample task, they will not catch on to the fact, they will not be able to realize that the food is now being placed under the new novel stimulus, which that would be like a normal reaction. But if you lesion or damage their medial temporal lobe, they will continue to pick up this original sample object. In this task, in the visual paired comparison task, they will not gaze at this new stimulus for very long at all. They will just continue to track the familiar stimulus. So damage again to the medial temporal lobe shows impairment in both of these kinds of tasks. In other studies that we have done with declarative memory in monkeys, we have been able to see that the amygdala is actually not so important for declarative memory. So we're going to look at, and I'm going to tell you what page that this is on so you can read more about this study. This is on page 383. So the hypothesis was that particular portions of the medial temporal lobe are required for the formation of new declarative memories. So what we wanted to really do with this study in looking at different areas of the medial temporal lobe, like, okay, so we know based off of the non-matching to sample task and the visual paired comparison task that the medial temporal lobe is important for declarative memory. But are there certain parts of, there are specific areas of the medial temporal lobe that are important for declarative memories? And what they saw is that the amygdala is not really important. So the amygdala is part of the medial temporal area, but it's not important for declarative memories. If we lesion the hippocampus alone, again, this is a structure that is within the medial temporal lobe. If we lesion the hippocampus alone, we start to see some impairment with declarative memory. If we damage or lesion the hippocampus and the adjacent entorhinal cortex, which is right here, so we have hippocampus and then you lesion the entorhinal cortex, you're going to see more impairment. However, when you see, when we lesion the hippocampus, the adjacent entorhinal cortex, and the parohippocampal cortices, that is when we see tons of impairment. So it has to be all three of these structures together. So as you can see, here's the results on this graph. So we have a memory score going from -1.5 to 1. This is a control. These monkeys did not have lesions at all in their brain. So as you can see, their memory score is good. H, this is hippocampus alone. You see that memory starts to decrease. Then you do H+. That is the hippocampus plus the entorhinal cortex. You start to see even more of a dramatic decrease in their memory score. However, when we see a lot of impairment is when lesions extend forward to also include the anterior entorhinal and pararhinal cortices. So we just call those parahippocampal cortices. So what I really want you guys to know from this study is that the most impairment is seen in H++ monkeys. It's when they have lesions to their hippocampus, the entorhinal, and the surrounding cortices. That is where the most impairment happens, whereas the least amount of memory happens when we just lesion the hippocampus alone. So I want you to be familiar with what we're lesioning and what is the effect that it has on memory. To kind of wrap up talking about memory with brain regions, I have some little kind of like visuals for you guys, because sometimes those are more helpful than just seeing notes written out. So we have long-term memory, and we've talked about declarative memory. And declarative memory can be separated into episodic memory and semantic memory. This is review from the beginning of lecture. And episodic memories we see are stored in the cortex. Specifically, we believe that episodic memories are in the right frontal and temporal regions of the cortex. And semantic memories are also stored in the cortex, but we perhaps think that these are especially in the temporal lobes. And again, this is from studies on lesioning, people who have had damage to these areas. This is how we're able to draw kind of where these different episodic and semantic memories are stored or processed in our brain. So the last slide was about declarative memories. Now we're going to switch into non-declarative memories or procedural memories. We have skill learning. So skill learning type memories, these are more like motor-based memories. So of course basal ganglia, because that is implicated in motor control. So we see that the brain areas implicated with skill learning are the basal ganglia, the motor cortex, and the cerebellum. With priming type of memory, priming learning and memory, there can be visual priming, so when you present somebody with a stimulus, or you can do it conceptually with meaning. And perceptually or visual priming is processed in the cortex. We particularly see decreased activity in the bilateral occipital temporal cortex, whereas conceptual priming, we see decreased activity in the left frontal cortex. And then we have conditioning. And we have a couple different types of conditioning. So there's simple delay conditioning or trace conditioning. You guys do not need to know the differences between all of these, but I do want you to know that conditioning is implicated in the cerebellar circuit, so in the cerebellum, and as well in the hippocampus and the cortex. With priming, know that it is in the cortex. The specifics of this, not necessarily, but know that priming is processed in our cortex. Conditioning is in the cerebellum, the hippocampus and the cortex, and skill learning is basal ganglia, motor cortex, and cerebellum. So these are the brain regions that we have found are associated with these different types of memories. How are memories stored? So it is proposed that memories are stored due to probably through plastic changes in the synapses of our neurons. Neuroplasticity is the changes in structure and function of your synapses. And these changes can be either presynaptic, postsynaptic, or they can be changes on both sides. They can be both presynaptic and postsynaptic changes. So neuroplasticity, we're trying to get at, okay, so we're taking this information in, we're trying to consolidate these memories, but like what is happening biologically? We know that they're in these brain regions, but what is even happening further biologically that makes these memories stored, that helps us be able to remember these things that we've learned? How does that even happen? So we think that that happens through neuroplasticity. So it is our neurons being able to change how they structure, change how they function, get stronger, get weaker, things like that. So So we had a researcher, Hebb, in 1949, and he suggested how learning could induce changes in your synapses. So learning leads to synaptic changes. And he created the Hebbian synapse. So that is what we kind of call his theory for how he was discussing synaptic changes. So a Hebbian synapse is when a presynaptic neuron repeatedly stimulates a postsynaptic neuron to fire. What happens is when you have a presynaptic neuron repeatedly stimulating a postsynaptic neuron, it's repeatedly firing, the synapse between those two neurons is going to become stronger. It's going to form a very secure connection. If you have synapses and those two neurons, the pre and postsynaptic neuron, are not really firing that much together, that connection is probably going to die off. It's kind of like a muscle, right? So your muscle isn't going to completely die off, but the more that you exercise your muscles, the stronger that they become. And that's the same idea with synapses. The more that certain connections are exercised or used, the stronger that they become. This gets at the idea that neurons that fire together wire together. So we're creating these strong connections between neurons. We can cause presynaptic or postsynaptic changes, but neurons that are firing together, your presynaptic is firing at your postsynaptic neuron, repeatedly all the time. It's being exercised more. Those connections are going to be really, really strong. Hebb came up with a dual trace hypothesis, and this suggests that memory formation involves two different traces. So first, learning sets up an activity that reverberates through neural circuits. So all of this saying is that when we're learning something, we have activities that are happening in our body, such as things like neurotransmitter release, right? You can pretty much trace anything back to neurons in our body releasing or blocking neurotransmitters, things like that. So learning is going to set up different activities in our bodies, such as activating certain transmitter systems. There's connections forming in our body. And this is able to hold the memory for a brief time. If it is strong enough, if the activity is strong enough, it is going to cause permanent changes in the circuit that learning activated. So you learn something for the first time, you have certain neurons that are going to fire with each other in a very particular sequence. So it's able to kind of hold that pattern momentarily. But then if you constantly activate that circuit that you initially activated when you were learning whatever you were learning, so say it's even driving a car, so you're moving your body in a different way, you're having to position yourself, put pressure here, it activates certain neurons, different motor neurons in your body. So the more that you perform that activity, you're going to cause there to be permanent changes in your neural circuitry, so that you don't have to, every time you go into your car, relearn how to drive. Your body, your brain has literally already created this neural circuitry that's like, okay, this is driving or this is riding a bike, which is really cool to think about. And so this then creates a long-lasting memory trace. So the first demonstration of learning-induced brain changes were a series of studies that they did in 1964, and these were called environmental enrichment studies. They're also known as ECIC studies. So in this experiment, there were 3 different conditions. This was done with rats. This was animal research. So we had 3 different conditions, and we wanted to see, okay, does the environment that these animals are in, is it going to impact their neural chemistry? So if neuroplasticity really exists, then we don't even have to, implant anything in them. We just want to see, just purely based off of the environment that they are in. How is that going to impact the way that their brain forms, things like that. It was total exploratory research, curious about how it would impact them. So we had the standard condition, which is this picture right up here. So the standard condition had 3 rats in the same cage. They had food, they had water. This is kind of just how rats are normally kept. Then there was an impoverished condition. This was 1 rat with 1 cage, and they had access to food and water. Now you might think like, oh, well, there's more rats in here and there's less space, so why isn't this one impoverished? So the impoverished condition has 1 rat by itself because depriving something of social interaction, that is definitely considered an impoverished condition. Rats need to be around other rats. They obviously need to do that for mating purposes, but just in general, they do require a level of social interaction, just like human beings. Animals do require that. There's not a lot of animals that don't like to run in packs with others of their kind. So this is why this is the impoverished condition. This rat is by itself, has access to food and water, but it's not able to be in a cage with other rats. Then we have what we call the enriched condition. So this is the enriched condition down here. So there's 10 to 12 rats, 1 really big, large cage. They put toys in there that are changed daily. Maybe they put a little wheel, little ramps that they can go up and down, things like have little bells on them. They like open the cage from time to time and kind of let them explore around a little bit. So this is like rat paradise. So that's why this is the enriched condition. This is like the tropical resort of rat living. So what did we find? So we compared all of these animals. We looked at different parts of their brain, trying to see, what's different. Are there differences really at all? And what happened is the animals in the enriched condition developed, this is supposed to say heavier, not Javier, heavier, thicker cerebral cortexes, increased cholinergic activity. So cholinergic means acetylcholine. So they had more acetylcholine activity, many more dendritic branches. So that we just mean that their neurons had a lot more dendrites than animals in the other conditions. This suggests to us that there are new synapses that have been formed, or more synapses that have been formed. They had larger cortical synapses, so the synapses took up more space. And they had more neurons in their hippocampus than rats in the other conditions. They were also able to have much better recovery from any sort of brain damage. So I wanted to focus in on the dendritic branching for a second. So this is an enlarged image of a neuron is used to quantify branching by either counts of the number of branches or the different orders. Or by counts of intersections. So this is just kind of a way that we are able to decide like, okay, is this more branches? Is this less? Because obviously these branches can be organized in kind of really weird kind of ways. But this is like a way in which we're able to quantify, okay, how many more branches that a neuron has. So here, over here, it shows us the enriched condition in green, the standard condition in blue, and the impoverished condition in red. And basically what this is telling us is that rats that were in the enriched condition had many more dendritic branches than the rats in the other conditions. So more recent findings on brain plasticity. So again, that whole condition study showed us that just by virtue of being in a certain environment has an impact on your brain development and how your brain is able to function, work for you better, different neural connections, more synapses. More recent findings for animals in enriched conditions show that they have larger hippocampuses compared to animals that are in standard or impoverished. Their newly born cells from neurogenesis live longer. They don't die off as quickly. And they are also able to have much better recovery from brain injury. We can test this when we transplant enriched conditioned stem cells into animals that were not a part of enriched condition. And those animals that have the enriched conditioned stem cells have much better progress from recovering from a brain injury. And recall that, neurons cannot duplicate, right? But they come from stem cells. So if we wanted to help an animal or help someone recover from something that involves them needing to produce more neurons, we would have to give them stem cells so that their body can form those stem cells into new neurons. So if we're taking the stem cells from enriched condition animals, we see that animals that have these types of stem cells are able to have better recovery. So clearly there is something about the way that these enriched condition animal stem cells operate. They're obviously stronger, and they can help other animals, when they are transplanted, be able to do things like recover. In general, we see that enriched experiences have a really positive impact on increased learning and problem-solving skills. They can aid in recovery for things like malnutrition, and they can act as a protection against age-related declines. So if you have someone who, this can get into a lot of discussions about socioeconomic status and the environment that people grow up in. If you have someone who lives in a situation where they're very cut off from a lot of social contacts, maybe they're very isolated, maybe it's very small, close quarters, they kind of only have the bare minimum, that would be something like an impoverished condition. If they live in that type of condition for really long periods of time, they're going to be someone who's going to be more apt to experience things like Alzheimer's or just different age-related diseases. They're going to have not as good problem-solving skills, communication skills, a lot of different things, and we will absolutely see brain differences in them. So you can tie brain plasticity in to a lot of different things that we encounter in our lives. The way that children grow up in the home. Do they have access to things that stimulate their learning at different stages? If you're interested in that, that's all developmental psychology. What happens if they're not? What kind of impacts does that have on them? So we talk about social impacts, right? But there are actual physical changes in someone's brain that we can see by virtue of them just being in one environment over another. And what's really cool also, as unfortunate as that can be, that means too that, okay, if we put someone in a better condition, that means that we can still help them because our brain is plastic. Our neurons are plastic. They are able to change. It's not totally irreversible. So that is what is really cool about brain plasticity and about the fact that our neurons and our brain are able to make these changes. And over the course of our lifetime, brain plasticity does not stop. When you are hit a certain age, you are capable of brain plasticity virtually for your entire life, which is very cool. Invertebrate systems also show synaptic plasticity or synaptic changes. So this is the Aplysia slug. This is a very famous study about brain plasticity. So in studies for this Aplysia slug, we are able to see something called habituation. And habituation is a decreased response following repeated presentation of a stimulus. So for example, if you are having lunch or having dinner somewhere and the door to the restaurant that you're at, it has a bell every single time that you open the door. So maybe as you're sitting there, you notice the bell every single time and it keeps dinging. People are walking in and out. Maybe you keep looking up. And then after a little bit, you become habituated to it. So you kind of stop responding to it. You realize like, okay, yeah, whatever, it's the bell, and you kind of tune it out. So that is an example of something repeatedly being shown to you, but it not producing any sort of response anymore. You're not turning towards the bell. You're not paying attention to it at all. So that is habituation. So we have learned about habituation with this little Aplysia slug. So the typical response for an Aplysia slug, if their siphon, which is right here, if their little siphon is squirted with water, it is going to retract its gill. And this is connected by a sensory neuron. There are sensory neurons in this siphon. They get activated. They know that they're supposed to retract. So squirt the siphon with water, the gill is going to retract. This is a typical response. What we see when this response has been habituated, so if we repeatedly squirt the gill with water, so we're repeatedly squirting this little siphon, you no longer see the gill retract. The Aplysia slug will get to a point where it will stop retracting its gill. It kind of learns like, okay, it's just water. This is not something that's harming me. Like, I don't really need to pay attention to this. So it stops retracting its gill. And what we see is that on a neural level, this is related with a decrease in neurotransmitter release. But what happens if this is repeated over days? What happens if we start to habituate this Aplysia slug to this response over the course of a few days and not just kind of like in, a few minutes or an hour or so? We see almost no response. There starts to be almost no neurotransmitter release here. So that is like full long-term habituation. So let's look at this on a neural level in some pictures. So in the beginning, you have the siphon. So again, this is this little guy right here. So when the siphon is first stimulated by a squirt of water, the Aplysia is going to retract its gill to try to protect this little siphon. And this is mediated by a sensory neuron, which is right here. And this synapse directly onto a motor neuron. That is what helps move the gill. So if the siphon is squirted repeatedly, the animal is going to habituate to the stimulus, and it's no longer going to retract its gill. And this is because this sensory neuron, after being repeatedly stimulated with the water, it knows, okay, this is, not dangerous. I think everything's fine. So it starts to release less neurotransmitter right here. So if you have less neurotransmitter being released by this sensory neuron, that means it's not going to activate this motor neuron as much. So you're going to see that the gill is not going to retract as much, or it's going to kind of stop retracting its gill altogether. If the siphon is squirted repeatedly over multiple days, the animal starts to habituate faster and faster each day until it gets to a point where it almost shows no response. So at first, you have the siphon, it gets squirted with water, it retracts, then maybe it starts to retract slower and slower. It's not having as much of like a immediate reaction, and then it's going to get to a point where you're going to see pretty much almost no response. The gill is not going to withdraw at all. It's not going to retract. And this is due to some synapses. You can literally see this in the neurons in these Aplysia slugs. You can see that there have been some synapses from the sensory neuron that are not synapsing onto this motor neuron anymore. So it has literally made a full-blown change at the synaptic level and taken some of these axon terminals away so that it's decreased its synapses. And again, this is just over a few days. We can already see changes like this. So this is just an example of brain plasticity just in a different type of animal, and how our neurons are definitely capable of making changes like this, such as forming new synapses or even taking them away in pretty much a very quick, in multiple days. I would deem that as relatively quick process. So this leads into us talking about long-term potentiation. So long-term potentiation is a stable, enduring increase in the effectiveness of a synapse. This was first found by researchers Bliss and Lomo in 1973. LTP is thought to be the cellular mechanism of memory and how memory happens and occurs. It is definitely related to what we talked about with like Hebbian synapses, neurons that fire together, wire together. LTP has mainly been studied in a particular area in the brain called the hippocampal formation. And there are at least 3 pathways within this hippocampal formation that we have seen LTP take place. LTP is also involved with the neurotransmitter glutamate. So what the heck even is LTP? Normally, in our bodies, there's relatively, low levels of activation. Your neurons are being activated. They're producing pretty stable EPSPs. We need more EPSPs than IPSPs to create action potentials, right? We all remember all of this super fun stuff. So normally you have like just pretty stable levels of EPSPs being fired and then causing chain reaction of communicating with more and more neurons. This does not really cause a whole lot of postsynaptic change. Things like pretty much stay the same. You have stable firing. You got your EPSPs rocking. All good. However, when you apply a tetanus, and a tetanus is a brief, very depolarizing, very strong stimulus. So we've been able to look at this in the laboratory when we've studied LTP. When you apply a tetanus, that is going to really, really highly activate those neurons. It's going to cause them to produce many strong EPSPs. And when you are having neurons produce a lot of really strong EPSPs, that is what is going to cause postsynaptic changes. So there has to be this kind of high activation going on in order for LTP to take place. But how exactly does this happen? This probably still sounds very confusing. So we are going to walk through this because I know that this is hard to understand. So again, really quick, normally you just have neurons communicating with each other. There's a relatively stable level of EPSP going on. Neurons are communicating with each other. It doesn't really require there to be a lot of postsynaptic or presynaptic changes in the neurons. They're good the way they are. They're firing, what have you. However, when you apply a tetanus, or let's apply this to when you are learning something for the first time, there is kind of like a burst of energy that causes neurons to communicate maybe differently, or there's kind of like a rapid firing. There's a high activation of certain neurons when you are in the process of learning. That is going to, on a neural level, cause there to be a lot of firing, so a lot of EPSPs. And so when you have a lot of firing and a lot of EPSPs happening, that can actually cause other postsynaptic changes to happen in the neuron. So we saw with the aplesia, just by habituating it to the water squirting, you were able to see branches and synapses literally disappear. With LTP, we're talking about something being stimulated so much that it is causing postsynaptic changes. So kind of a similar idea. But this happens in a little bit different of a way. So we're going to look at exactly how LTP takes place. What are the changes? So we said how it can make postsynaptic changes. What do those changes even look like? So these again are neurons we're talking about in the hippocampal formation. And in the hippocampal formation, this is where we have studied LTP. We find these receptors called NMDA and AMPA receptors. These are types of glutamate receptors. So we find these NMDA and AMPA receptors on neurons in the hippocampal formation. And what is going to happen is that when glutamate is released, it stimulates AMPA receptors. AMPA receptors and NMDA receptors are like right near each other, okay? So glutamate gets released, it's going to stimulate these AMPA receptors. These NMDA receptors that are right next to these AMPA receptors cannot respond until enough AMPA receptors have been stimulated. So the real way in which glutamate is able to exert its effect is by stimulating NMDA receptors. But in order to stimulate NMDA receptors, it has to first stimulate enough AMPA receptors. So glutamate has to stimulate enough AMPA receptors in order to kind of unlock these NMDA receptors. NMDA receptors have calcium channels. So once an NMDA receptor is activated, it is going to allow influx of calcium. At rest, what's going on with these NMDA receptors is that they have a little magnesium block in their calcium channel. And the only way that this block can be removed and allow the flow of calcium to run through this receptor is if there are enough AMPA receptors that are stimulated. So let's go through that again. In the hippocampal formation, there's mainly neurons that are producing glutamate. And the receptors that respond to glutamate are NMDA and AMPA receptors. So if you look at a neuron that releases glutamate, what you're going to find is that you have these NMDA receptors and AMPA receptors that are right next to each other. Glutamate cannot directly just bind to these NMDA receptors and affect them. It's kind of this chain reaction that has to occur. So glutamate is going to actually jump on to these AMPA receptors. And the reason it has to do that, it has to stimulate enough of these AMPA receptors because the goal is that it's trying to unblock these NMDA receptors that have magnesium in them. So this is why if glutamate were to just bind onto the NMDA, it can't produce its effect because there's a block on it. So it has to stimulate enough of these AMPA receptors. And then when enough of those are stimulated, that is going to unblock the magnesium from the NMDA receptor, and it's going to cause an influx of calcium. So LTP enhances the synapse by increasing the influx of calcium. That is going to make for an influx of calcium would be a strong EPSP. The influx of calcium, when calcium is able to enter into the cell, it causes these second messenger systems to be activated, and it actually causes this retrograde transmitter, which we think travels back to the presynaptic cell, and it stimulates even more glutamate release, so then glutamate can continue to affect the AMPA receptors, and then the NMDA, we can have more calcium. So what happens when we have this increased release in glutamate, so calcium is able to enter, then you have the retrograde, the RTs, traveling back to help it release more glutamate from the presynaptic cell. Our body responds to that by saying, okay, now I have all of this glutamate in my synapse, I need to create more receptors. So our body increases the amount of AMPA receptors on the postsynaptic cell. So LTP increases the effectiveness of a synapse by increasing the amount of postsynaptic receptors. So it increases AMPA receptors. And it also impacts transmitter release. It helps our body to release more calcium and therefore have us produce more receptors. And so it's making these connections really, really strong. We think that LTP, this what's going on neurologically, is a mechanism for learning and memory. We think that LTP takes place when we are learning new things, learning tasks, learning information, just in general. Obviously, learning implicated with memory. So once we learn something, it's when it gets consolidated into our memory. We think that that is due to these pre- and postsynaptic changes that are associated with LTP. So let's go over that in a picture format so that this is a little more clear. So first, normally we have, so here's an NMDA receptor and we have AMPA receptor. So like I said, these are always found right next to each other because one impacts the other. The AMPA receptor is going to help this NMDA receptor be able to react to glutamate. So these are always found like right near each other. So normally, this little NMDA receptor is blocked with a magnesium molecule. And glutamate binds onto an AMPA receptor. It can affect the AMPA receptor. Once we have more of this little plug can go away. So with repeated activation of AMPA receptors, like I said, it causes there to be depolarization, and it lends itself to this little magnesium plug jumping off. So again, has to be repeated stimulation. So again, if we're like learning something new for the first time, it's creating these new connections. Our hippocampal formation, we have neurons that are firing. So if they're repeatedly firing, what's going to happen is that the stimulation of these AMPA receptors helps this little magnesium plug jump off. And once that little magnesium plug goes away, we have calcium is able to enter the neuron now, because that's what this channel, that's what these NMDA channels are responsible for. They're responsible for allowing calcium to flow through. So now that this magnesium plug is gone and we have like a rapid influx of calcium, that causes there to be even more changes. And it causes these little second messenger systems on the inside of the neurons to create these retrograde little transmitters that leave the cell and go back to the presynaptic neuron and help this presynaptic neuron produce and release more glutamate so that we can keep having activation of AMPA and activation of NMDA, because that is what makes this whole process work, is when there is repeated stimulation by glutamate on these receptors. So not only are we able to unplug this NMDA receptor, but then what happens is we are now impacting there to be even more release of glutamate. So these changes make your synapses more responsive. They're like, oh wow, I'm getting a lot of glutamate now. Now there's a lot of repeated stimulation of glutamate. Your postsynaptic cell now starts to have a stronger response, and see how now it has created more AMPA receptors to meet the challenge of receiving more glutamate. So this is an example of how, at a synaptic level, how neurons can create stronger connections to each other. So when you are increasing the amount of receptors that can gather these neurotransmitters, that is a stronger synapse. That synapse is more sensitive to those neurotransmitters. We're going to watch a video about LTP that again just describes this in a little more of a visual format in case you're still kind of confused on what the heck is going on.
Welcome to 2 Minute Neuroscience, where I explain neuroscience topics in 2 minutes or less. In this installment, I will discuss long-term potentiation, or LTP. LTP is a process by which synaptic connections between neurons become stronger with frequent activation. LTP is thought to be a way in which the brain changes in response to experience, and thus may be a mechanism underlying learning and memory. There are a number of ways in which LTP can occur. The best known mechanism involves a glutamate receptor known as the NMDA receptor. In NMDA receptor-dependent LTP, glutamate release first activates a subtype of glutamate receptor known as the AMPA receptor. NMDA receptors are found nearby these AMPA receptors, but are not activated by low levels of glutamate release because the ion channel of an NMDA receptor is blocked by a magnesium ion. If frequent action potentials cause greater stimulation of AMPA receptors, however, this will cause the postsynaptic neuron to depolarize, which eventually causes the voltage-dependent magnesium blockage of the NMDA receptor to be removed, allowing calcium ions to flow in through the NMDA receptor. This influx of calcium initiates cellular mechanisms that cause more AMPA receptors to be inserted into the neuron's membrane. The new AMPA receptors are also more responsive to glutamate and allow more positively charged ions to enter the cell when activated. Now the postsynaptic cell is more sensitive to glutamate because it has more receptors to respond to it. Additionally, there are thought to be signals that travel back across the synapse to stimulate greater levels of glutamate release. All of this makes the synapse stronger and more likely to be activated in the future. This process is also associated with changes in gene transcription in the neuron, which can lead to the production of new receptors or modifications to the structure of the cell. These changes seem to be important for making the increased responsiveness of LTP long-lasting.
You deserve skincare that works.
Okay, so I hope that video helped clear up some of what I was talking about LTP. So big things I want you to know about LTP, where it occurs, where it's mainly been studied. So the hippocampal formation, that is related to glutamate, and that repeated stimulation of those neurons that release glutamate can cause postsynaptic and presynaptic changes. So it can cause how LTP enhances the effectiveness of a synapse by increasing the amount of postsynaptic receptors and also impacting the actual release of glutamate itself, and how that makes for creating a stronger connection. So the last part of our lecture is about Alzheimer's disease. So this is in page 414 to 415 in your book. Alzheimer's disease is a drastic decrease in cognitive ability. It is a form of dementia. It is characterized by severe memory failure and loss of orientation. It affects about 5.1 million people in the United States. And mostly these people are above the age of 65, but this is not normal aging patterns. Alzheimer's disease is not a normal progression of age. It is definitely a disease in the body. It is possible to get Alzheimer's before the age of 65. That would be known as early onset Alzheimer's disease. So that's just some facts about what Alzheimer's disease is and who it affects. So what does Alzheimer's look like, just kind of outwardly? So in the beginning, and this also shows the progression of somebody's brain with Alzheimer's disease. In the beginning, the individual who suffers from Alzheimer's maybe cannot remember recent events. They can't remember where they went to the store when they had to go out earlier. They can't remember what they had for breakfast. They can't remember what they did the day before. So it starts with not being able to remember recent events. As it gets progressed, it can transfer into complete, full memory impairment. They don't know where they are, so they're disoriented. They don't know who anyone is. Even people in their family, they don't know who they are. There definitely, yes, are times where people can, for brief periods, not have fully normal memory, but they can go through periods of time where they do recognize people, but then it usually does definitely go back to them not being able to recognize those individuals. It can be extremely painful for the family members of people who have Alzheimer's disease. And in the very advanced stages, there can be lack of conversation to almost complete no speech because they're just so confused and disoriented that it just kind of like shuts them down. Brain changes in Alzheimer's disease. There are various changes that we are able to see. One of them is cortical atrophy, so the decrease in cortical brain tissue. So this is a decrease in cortical activity and cortical volume. So this is someone who is a healthy control, and this is someone who has Alzheimer's. And you can see how the cortex has significantly decreased tissue, and they have it particularly in the posterior parietal and temporal lobes. This also shows it in the occipital. There's hippocampal atrophy. So again, cortical atrophy is the decrease in not only cortical activity, but also cortical volume. You can also see cortical atrophy in these pictures right here. So we're talking about the cortex, that's cortical, and then atrophy is it disappearing or lessening. We also see these things called amyloid plaques, and amyloid plaques are from there's a substance called beta amyloid, and it is a buildup. So people who have Alzheimer's produce a lot of this substance called beta amyloid, and we're very curious as to why that happens and what really causes that. And what happens is that the buildup forms these little plaques, and I'll show you all a picture of that. Individuals with Alzheimer's also have these things called neurofibrillary tangles. And what these are is there are proteins inside almost pretty much every neuron in our body. And what happens is that people who have Alzheimer's, the proteins inside of their neurons get all kind of like tangled up and disorganized. There's a specific pattern that these proteins should be in, and for whatever reason, individuals with Alzheimer's, they get all tangled up. The more tangles that we see in someone, we have seen is directly related to the severity of their cognitive impairment. So more tangles equals more cognitive impairment. So this is a standard control. So someone who does not have Alzheimer's, this is of course a neuron. So we have our little cell body, and here's our axon. These are our dendrites. And so you can see in someone with Alzheimer's, the proteins inside of their neurons are all tangled up. So these are what neurofibrillary tangles look like. And then we have amyloid plaques. So this is a substance called beta amyloid, and it's kind of all clumped together, and it forms what we call amyloid plaques. We also see individuals with Alzheimer's have decreased number of neurons that produce acetylcholine in their basal forebrain. So this is a MRI of someone who has Alzheimer's. So we can see a control, someone with cognitive impairment and someone with Alzheimer's disease, and we are looking at beta amyloid that is produced in their body. So there's this Pittsburgh blue dye. It's a special kind of dye, and it really has a high affinity for beta amyloid. So that means that it binds to beta amyloid really, really well. So as we can see down here, the more PIB dye that we can see, the more that we can see the beta amyloid plaques. So the red portions are going to be places where beta amyloid is really highly condensed, whereas the purple means that there's not really any beta amyloid. So in a control, someone who does not have cognitive impairment or Alzheimer's disease, we can see that the range of this dye is like purple to like about this blue. So that means that there's not really a whole lot of beta amyloid going on over here. This person does not have a lot of beta amyloid in their brain. However, when we move over to someone who has cognitive impairment, we start to see a lot higher levels of beta amyloid in their brain. So again, these high numbers we would see like red, yellow, even green. So we're seeing a lot more red. So the dye is really, really sticking to all the beta amyloid that it finds over here. So this is showing a way more beta amyloid than the control. Now you switch over to the individual with Alzheimer's disease, and you can see that there is even significantly more beta amyloid, especially in the frontal lobes, than the individual, just the elderly person with cognitive impairment. So clearly beta amyloid is very, very much implicated in Alzheimer's disease. It is something that they are looking at in studies to figure out, why do these people with Alzheimer's produce this beta amyloid? What is it in their body? What is it genetic? It's just something interesting to show you about Alzheimer's disease. And that concludes our lecture. I know that this lecture had a lot of material, a lot of information. We got back to talking about neurons and neural communication. So please let me know if there's anything in here that does not make sense or that you would like more clarification on, and I am happy to help you. Congratulations on finishing your last lecture of the semester. Good luck studying for your exam.